Hello out there, you marvelous minnows. Thanks for joining us for another week of A Little Greener, a podcast all about nature, conservation, and sustainability. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Sara, and I am joined by the also marvelous Casey. Casey, it's, I guess, good to see you virtually today.
This is like a letdown because we literally saw each other less than 48 hours ago. I was in Florida and it was so good to see your face.
It was wonderful. We had a delightful time.
Yes.
We did not do any podcasting.
We did not.
But
no.
It was glorious to be in the same space for a little bit.
Yes, we'll post a picture. It was nice and warm and relaxing and wonderful. And yay. So now I'm back in PA. And of course, today was like a 40-degree raining kind of day, but it's supposed to be nicer again tomorrow and the sun will go out. So maybe I'll be a little less sad about it.
There you go.
How was your week? Any updates?
No update. Oh, wait, yes, I do. I have an update that I'm excited about. If you remember, if you've listened to our sort of New Year episode from earlier this year, where we talked about our goals, resolutions, whatever, for ourselves and for the podcast, one of the things that I talked about was just wanting to learn more, kind of a general thing. And I'm going to be not quite taking a class because that costs money, but I've joined a webinar series that a university is putting on. So it's part of a class that you can take and pay for, but I'm just doing the free webinar portion. And it's called, I think it's called God, Country, and Climate Change. But it's from a Christian university, but it's talking about it's going to have both like the biblical basis for creation care and also a look at the science behind anthropogenic climate change and how to have those conversations and putting all of that stuff together. I'm super excited about it, and that starts next week. So I feel like I've taken a step towards my eco goals for the year.
Yeah, check that little box off. That's awesome. That is such a great, like, tailored to you.
I was gonna say it's a really nice combo of, I mean, not only that goal, but my basis for why I care about the environment, comes a lot from that. So I'm excited to have that basis, but also be learning more about the science and all of that.
Yeah, keep us updated on that. That's going to be super cool. I got to see your sunflower at your house. Yep. I think this week I'll start my vegetable planting.
Yay!
Which is a little early, but the weather is letting us, so we're gonna give it a shot. So if any of you out there are interested in talking more about that, we can always do more about that.
They are. I know they are.
So
some of them I know.
Yeah, with food prices especially being so crazy recently, it's kind of exciting to like take a little control out of that. I have said it many times, at least in real life, that my goal is to never pay for lettuce ever again, because we have tortoises and they're always eating leafy greens. And it's like one of the easiest things to grow for a long point of the year. And I want to give them nice stuff, but I don't want to pay for it anymore.
Right.
So that's the goal.
I would like a step-by-step tutorial because I want to grow things too, and I don't know what I'm doing.
Okay, well, maybe we'll have to do that. Maybe we'll have to do a food gardening episode, because that can definitely impact your carbon footprint, and it can be done eco-friendly wise. And hey, nothing's more local than your backyard. So, Sara, this week I kind of teased it before. We're going to be talking about the Ohio train derailment that happened about a month ago from when this pod is coming out at this point.
Time flies.
Yes. Yeah. So we kind of put off doing it right away because there's been new information. Like we were just saying, there was a live press conference maybe an hour ago. So this episode's information is the best I could put together from current data.
Right.
But there is a good chance that soon after it will be
there might be more, or some things might have adjusted a little bit, but I think the things that we're going to talk about, I think, are pretty well
established.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yep. So there'll be lots and lots of references in the notes. A lot of it is crowdsourced from the New York Times and NPR and CNN, and then also some government press conferences from the Associated Press, the EPA, all sorts of different places are now talking about it and doing a better job. So there should be lots of opportunity to learn more. All right, Sara, my question for you today is trains. You been on one? You interact with them at all? How do you feel about trains?
We were laughing about this, but I actually think it's a great question. Partially because I feel like I need to set the record straight, because I feel like I may have said before that I've never been on a train. I've never taken a train trip. Like, I would love to do travel across the country in a train and get to see things. I have, however, been on a train. I always forget about it, but when I was living in Fort Worth, there was just a little commuter train to go from Fort Worth to Dallas. And so I did that a couple of times for events like a hockey game and a concert that I went to in Dallas. I loved it. I thought that was fantastic. I feel like trains are the public transportation that I could really get behind if we had a decent system here. We don't, but
bad.
but that commuter train was fantastic, because driving in Dallas, I only did it once when I moved down there. I drove through Dallas and it was the worst. I hated it. That kind of thing gives me anxiety, driving in big cities and not knowing where you're going and finding a place to park and all of that craziness. So the train was so easy. It was so convenient. I loved it. So my limited train experience has been positive.
Yeah, I would say when trains work well, they're awesome. Like, I'm on the East Coast, so there's a lot more trains going on. So I've taken them to New York. I took them from college back home. I also lived in Europe for a short period of time, where trains are much more the norm versus driving places. And so I would take the train all the time around Northern Ireland. And it was a really efficient, easy way to get around. And obviously there's some really great things about not having a personal vehicle, having carbon dioxide out there. So trains definitely are an opportunity the U.S. has to expand upon. But then you have stories like this week, and you might think, oh, there's some issues that we need to sort through, because we use trains not just for transportation of humans, but of lots of other goods too. So this week we're going to talk about what happened in Ohio in the beginning of February, and what's still happening in Ohio after this derailment. I might accidentally refer to it as an accident, but some of the National Transportation Board has basically said we don't want to really call it an accident, because there's lots of things that could have been prevented to this to make it not as much of an accident. So I'm going to try and refer to it as a derailment, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And we are back to talk about the East Palestine train derailment. Sarah, do you remember when we did our episode about air pollution, when we talked about Denora, which was a small town in Pennsylvania?
Yes.
This intro reminds me a little bit of that. So I'm going to try and paint a picture of what exactly happened in this incident, and then we'll sort of step back to what those broad impacts are. If you want to learn more about how, like, kind of an acute disaster turns into a long-term problem, that air pollution episode sort of goes through that. So maybe that's a model of how we're going to find out more about what happens in this incident as well. But basically, on February 3rd, 2023, a train owned by Norfolk Southern Railroad Company was traveling from Madison, Illinois to Conway, Pennsylvania. The train was about 150 cars long and was carrying a variety of goods, including cement, frozen vegetables, plastic pellets, with 20 of those cars carrying hazardous materials. So first pause. I don't know that it's ever really occurred to me that all of those things would be on one train.
No, I know. I understand very little about how freight trains work, I guess. You see them all the time, and I've lived not too far from train yards at certain points in life and things like that. And so you just see all those giant cars. I don't ever think too much about what all gets transported that way and how that works.
Yeah, one's got frozen vegetables and one's got cement on it. Like, it just seems very random, but obviously.
But I guess it's just getting things where they need to go.
They got to get somewhere.
It's more about where they're going than what it is.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's different types of train cars involved. As it was traveling, one of the wheel ball bearings started to get overheated, and it was getting hotter and hotter as the train went on. Along those railroads, there are wayside defect detectors, which are basically built in to detect if there's something weird going on with the train that would make it need to stop to be inspected. And it passed at least 2 of those, with the temperature of the bearing did not quite hit the threshold for triggering an audible alarm for the crew to slow the train. By the time it passed a 3rd detector, the heat, which was clocking in about 250 degrees above ambient temperature, triggered an audible alarm, but at that point, it was too late. As the crew immediately reacted to that alarm, they started slowing the train. The faulty wheel bearing broke, and at about 9 p.m., 38 of those cars derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, which is a town of approximately 4,800 people just on the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania. So if you go to like Google Maps and you look, I wanted to see how far it was. It's just literally right on the border between those 2 states. So both Pennsylvania and Ohio have been involved in the reaction to this. Both residents from both states are involved in what happened here. Now, according to the Federal Railroad Administration, there are approximately 1,000 train derailments a year.
This was stunning to me, actually. This is one of the things that I looked up after this happened, because it was just one of the things that you start hearing about and how rare is this and all of that. That was a really surprising number to me, because you don't hear about them that often. But I read that already this year, 2 months into the year, there have been like a dozen incidences.
Right, which would put it on the low end, because at this point, it's like 2 to 3 a day.
It was one of those sort of fact check type of things, because I guess there were rumblings out there that, oh, this is weird, like this is unusual, and they were like, actually it's not to have that number.
Right, yeah, then it's not, and it averages about 4 deaths a year that can be attributed to train derailments. No one was hurt in the initial derailment. However, this derailment was different and caught the news, unlike lots of other ones, because 20 of those cars were carrying hazardous materials, including 11 of them that came off the track and subsequently caught fire. While the cars had plastic labels to identify the contents on each of the cars, those plastic labels melted.
Oh.
Yeah.
Didn't think about that.
That's one of the things that came out pretty recently. And so that made it difficult for first responders and firefighters to understand what exactly they were dealing with when they first got to the blaze, because they didn't know what was in the cars.
That seems like a preventable thing.
Yes, that has since been identified as a thing that we could very easily fix to not have happen again. What we do know is 5 of the train cars were carrying more than 115,000 gallons of vinyl chloride, which is an ingredient in PVC. I feel like a lot of people, when they know about plastics, know like a PVC pipe, but it's used in lots of different things, from construction to medical equipment. And at ambient temperature, it exists as a colorless gas that smells sweet, but it's normally transported as a compressed liquid. So it's then mixed in to make PVC. Health impacts of this gas include shortness of breath, headaches, and dizziness, with chronic exposure linked to liver damage and rare types of cancer. Other hazardous materials on the train included ethylene glycol monobutyl ether and ethyl hexyl acrylate, which is used in paints, caulks, and adhesives, and isobutylene. At least one of the cars lost all of its butyl acrylate, and the contents of these cars were catching on fire. The initial fire was contained within about 2 hours, but one rail car with that vinyl chloride was still recorded as having rising temperatures internally due to chemical reactions that were happening with the vinyl chloride. So at that point, it had been heated to a point where that chemical was changing, and they were concerned that it was going to explode, and that would have shot shrapnel up to a mile away. So they decided to do a, quote, controlled release of the vinyl chloride and asked for an evacuation of a 1 by 2 mile area on both sides of the state line around East Palestine. When burned, vinyl chloride degrades into hydrogen chloride and phosgene. Apparently, phosgene smells like hay, which I think is interesting because most of the time I don't think of that as like a chemical smell. They released the vinyl chloride on February 6th. It lit on fire. There was a huge plume of black smoke, and they were able to finally extinguish all of the fire on February 8th. They tested the air in the area, and the evacuation order was then lifted. The air quality has been tested and deemed safe before the residents were allowed home.
In terms of painting a picture, can you imagine being, if you're close enough, I don't know what within that radius, what folks could see or if they knew about it before, but then just sort of getting this evacuation order. Hey, we're going to be releasing this chemical and burning it off. So we need you to get all your stuff and get out. Like, that's just not on my bingo card. Like, I'm not prepared for that scenario. What a crazy thing to have to do. Gather up your stuff and go find somewhere to stay.
Yeah, get out. And they were very, very serious about it. The Ohio governor was like, you're going to be considered basically like a obstruction to this process if you don't get out.
And I know, like, living in Florida, people evacuate a lot for hurricanes and things like that, but there's some warning that that's coming. This is just such a freak thing that you can't see coming.
The closest thing I could think of during this whole thing is last May, a block away from my mom's house, there was a house explosion, and the house basically exploded to the point of disintegration. I think there were 7 people killed, and it was an awful thing to happen that still has no explanation. They still haven't figured out what caused it. But I think for the residents in that area, like, they probably had a very similar thought, which is like, this happened. It was already initially terrifying, like having, there was a derailment of hazardous materials in my neighborhood. That's what this train is. There's an explosion of a house that we don't really understand, but also I don't know what's next. I don't know what the long-term implications are. And there's some other similarities that I'll talk about as we get a little bit further into this, but that's the closest I could think of. And I know how scary it was for everybody in that neighborhood. And some of those people couldn't ever return home because their houses were condemned. But for this, luckily, because they didn't have the explosion, basically the Ohio governor was saying that neither options of like burning it or the car exploding were great options. We didn't like either of those options, but this seemed to be the lesser of the evils. Like, having an explosion just didn't seem to be a good option for there. So residents returned, and this is a very small town, like 4,800 people, very close-knit community. Residents returned, and the air quality and the water quality was deemed as safe. They reported an odor like nail polish remover, with eye irritation, trouble breathing, and mysterious rashes popping up in the days following. Initially, it was reported that 3,500 fish had died in the days after the derailment. That number was recently updated to over 38,000 fish and 5,000 other aquatic animals. So that's pretty crazy too. They were able to, like, I guess, go in and identify over 2,000 fish that had died shortly thereafter. And based on the area that the chemicals leaked into, were able to extrapolate that that's approximately how many animals they were. Okay. They have not like body counted all of these. Right. And I did see videos of residents like going to their local streams and taking video and like throwing rocks and showing that there were things, still chemicals within that water system. So that, I think, started the general vibe coming out of this, which is that, okay, this happened, the initial event, and now authorities are saying it's okay to go back home, but residents did not feel safe. Like they were still reporting symptoms. It again reminds me of that house explosion, because basically our power company was like, wasn't us. And the residents in the area were like, we've actually reported the smell of gas in this area for months. Mm-hmm. So it feels a little bit like you're not really telling the full story here. You're just trying to save face. And that's, I think, what these residents are sort of feeling too, is you can say that the readings are okay, but that doesn't negate my rash, or in this case, people's coming home to pets and livestock that had also died or become ill in that time period.
Right. It's hard. And I think this is one of the things that I struggle with most, in this story? Because I don't know about you, Casey. I learned of this first from a social media post.
Yeah.
I saw this on social media before, but I actually saw it on like an eco Instagram account that I follow, but it was all just residents, sharing their stories. And I was like, so I Googled it, and there were major news outlets reporting on it. They just hadn't popped up. I hadn't seen or heard about it, but I found out about it on social media. So that's, I think, been an interesting dynamic to come out of this, is I think all of the social media posting and the reports from the people that are living there are super important and helping to generate interest in the story. But it's also a challenge. I mean, the EPA is there, FEMA's there. So I feel like there's a lot of nuance in the conversation where it's because I want to believe that these people are telling us the truth, right? I want, they're saying the levels are safe, but I feel like there has to be more clarity on what that actually means, because we're talking about not only dosage, but also length of time of exposure. And so I feel like that needs to be made more clear. And I think, the concerns of the people. If I lived in that town, man, I would be freaking out for sure. So it's easy for me to sit over here and say, but they're saying it's okay. I think it's a very legitimate concern for the folks that live there to want to make sure that everything really is being done and that they're getting all the information that they need. But I feel like it's an interesting dynamic that we're seeing come out of this.
I agree. I think I first saw that the train derailed from like some sort of news alert on my phone, but the social media is where I started to get hey, we're not covering this enough. Mm-hmm. Hey, this is actually could end up being a really big ecological disaster that we're just sort of brushing under the rug. And it is that tension between, yes, what are the authorities saying? What are the residents experiencing? And, residents, again, they could totally be also telling the truth, but also have some confirmation bias, like when something bad happens and then you're like, well, my cat died too. So like that
and
is connected.
And you can get rashes from stress. And I would be dang stressed out.
Shingles.
So like it's you can't say that what they're, reporting is explicitly for sure coming from this, but that doesn't mean you can dismiss it either.
Right. And there's a little bit more context too, a little bit later on as well. So people were evacuated, but many residents who returned home reported that their pets or livestock animals have had health issues, including sudden death and seizures. I've seen reports saying like somebody's cat, someone's chickens, a very young cow. I haven't seen some sort of aggregated, like this many pets, this many of this is what we're experiencing. So it feels more anecdotal because that's all we have.
And I haven't seen any of that confirmed to be definitely connected yet. Mm-hmm. So it's just important to keep in mind that doesn't mean it isn't. It hasn't been reported yet.
Right. And so my guess is that some of these news outlets at least are erring on the side of caution to not report it that way. That being said, there is a class action lawsuit filed by the Sandusky-based Murray law firm on behalf of residents within 2 miles of the derailment for these incidences, saying that like we're asking that Norfolk take responsibility for the deaths of these animals. And so my guess is over the next several years, there will be discovery phases. Yeah. I know when they were talking about that cow that they're sending out tissue samples to see if some of those chemicals are detected within the tissue, that you can make that definitive link. That's also an issue. It's like, they would really do need a sample size of a certain amount to be able to say, hey, mortality rates were X amount above normal mortality rates to prove, even if there was causation, the proof is the hard part. So the EPA has determined the air quality is more or less the same as it was prior to the derailment at that point, showing no chemical levels at a level of concern. As you pointed out, what a level of concern is like, okay, what is your level of concern? Right. My level of concern.
Exactly. And again, I feel like, if you're talking about level of concern for acute, like that's different. This is going to be around for a little bit. I mean, there. I don't know. Again, I don't want to say because I have not looked up how long these chemicals last, but that's my, if these things are going to be in the air for a length of time and these people are living there, what does that mean,
Right. My understanding is that the initial plume of smoke, all of that has dissipated from the air. The concern at this point is when you burn chemicals, they turn into different chemicals a lot of times. And that's when they're going to be settling in the water, settling in the soil for longer periods of time. And so the thing you were initially testing for isn't necessarily what is there that could still cause issues. One of these is dioxins, which I guess are a byproduct of when you burn some of these things. And so that's something that activists and like doctors and scientists are unclear about whether the EPA is testing for those dioxins rather than just the initial like vinyl chloride and the phosgene and things like that. The EPA has also tested the municipal drinking water. They say that is safe, but has recommended people with private wells get their wells tested before drinking it. So I know on both sides of the state line, they think they've tested initially like 25 wells. It's hard to say exactly where they're at now. And they tested the interior homes air quality of at least 550 local residences. So they have done like a lot of testing. But yeah, that's it. You can say it's fine, but so another example, my sister at her apartment, a local cheesesteak shop caught fire and she had to be evacuated from her place, and the smoke went up into her apartment, and she came in and it smelled like smoke, it smelled like chemicals, it smelled horrible. She had to get pay for cleaning and things like that, had to prove to the insurance company that it was worth cleaning, and it still didn't smell 100% right, even though they say, oh, it's safe to inhabit. And that's something these residents are also experiencing. It's like, that's cool that you say it's fine, but like my house still smells, or the walls need scrubbing, and there needs to be additional cleanup than maybe just what the ambient like air quality is at the time. At this point, 1.1 million gallons of water and 4,600 yards of contaminated soil have been removed from the site. I think that the water is going to Texas.
Yeah.
And
which I've read that there were some concerns around too, how that happened, but
yes, same thing. The soil's going to Michigan, and the Michigan representative was like, nobody told me about this. Mm-hmm. So that's another actual point we can talk about as well. So the EPA, the transportation department, says that this disaster was completely preventable. So why did it happen then if it was preventable? Sarah, have you heard any of the arguments from the different stakeholders about who's to blame and all of that?
I've heard a little, and I hate so I was a little, when you talked at the beginning about not calling it an accident, like I understand why folks are saying that, but I also feel like it's how you want to look at the word accident. Like my feeling is nobody wants this to happen.
True.
This is a bad thing. Norfolk Southern is not happy that this happened, and at least what they're saying so far is it does not look like there was any error on the part of any of the crew. Is that what you call it? The people on the train? I don't know. So that's why in my mind, I call it an accident, even though I understand the reason behind that feeling, because if we can do better, we should be doing better. So the biggest thing I've heard, and I always hate when we start bringing politics into these tough situations, but the one that I at least first heard about was about the rollbacks of regulations regarding train braking systems that happened under the Trump administration. That was not the cause of this particular incident, which I get. In my mind, again, if this makes me think of when my car was totaled, when somebody hit my car and I had to get a new car, and I was told my car had a specific safety feature that didn't end up having, and I'm real mad about it because I just wanted, even though this safety feature that I thought I was getting would not have prevented the accident that I was in, I was just very concerned about safety at that point. It was such a freak accident. I was really hesitant. Driving made me uncomfortable. I just wanted my car to be as safe as possible. That's what I feel about this regulation. I understand that it didn't cause this accident, but if it can prevent more things like this from happening in the future, in my mind, we should be doing it. But so anyway, that's probably the biggest one that I've heard of. And then there was a little bit, you talked about those like wayside detection system things not detecting the heat early enough. I was just reading about that one today, how those are like, there's not a set level basically, right, for what those need to be at, and those are kind of determined independently, so those can differ from company to company.
Yes, yeah. So what you said about the rollback of regulations is correct. So in 2015, the Obama administration, responding to a train derailment outside Philadelphia, put into place a regulation which was addressing trains carrying hazardous materials, which help regulate speeds and braking systems. One of the reports that I heard about the braking systems is basically trains right now have the system that they've had for a really long time, which is that you throw on the brakes and then the first car stops and then the second car stops and then the third car stops. And there's updated technology where basically you throw on the brake and each individual car simultaneously would all stop.
That seems incredibly logical to me. And I guess I didn't realize that wasn't sort of how it worked.
Standardized, right?
Huh.
Yeah. And I mean, I can't say that like I don't know how much time is in between, but basically it's a more centralized communication that seems to make sense. And especially in this particular scenario where there's not a lot of time between when you're figuring out something's wrong and when you have to stop it from going wrong, like every little bit counts. So that was implemented in 2015. The Trump administration rolled back this regulation in 2018. The New York Times and the Washington Post both said that this rule would not have impacted this train since it wasn't deemed hazardous. And also speed was not the issue in this particular case. It seems to be that faulty bearing. If it had been declared hazardous, Ohio state officials would have been notified that it was traveling through the state. I don't know how much of a difference that would have made. Like, that's something that the governor of Ohio was like, well, gee, I really wish we would have known this was happening. And maybe if it had, they would have had like the manifest of what was on it, which is important. But I mean, it's sort of like some of the arguments I've also been seeing of like, well, the residents should be notified that there's hazardous materials traveling through their neighborhood. Well, I mean, how many of those people have the financial resources to decide that they're not going to live near the train that occasionally has hazardous material coming down the line?
Right. I don't know what good that would do for people.
Right. So I agree on this one. It's this rule in particular is not the reason that this happened. I think it comes into more play when you have what I think is a completely aside argument about who's showing up at East Palestine, basically. There's some arguments about like what politicians should be there, who shouldn't be there, what that means. I'm going to leave that up to the residents about what that makes them feel. But from a regulatory perspective, to throw around that when we have other things that can help with the safety, I think that that's probably what we need to be focused on. But that rule, not one of them. Congress is another person that I've actually seen blamed entity that I've seen blamed. So last year, do you remember the railroad strikes, Sarah?
Not really, if I'm being honest. I'm sure I was aware of them at the time, but you know how I am.
Yeah, I think it was in the fall. So railroad workers were going on strike. The main point that was in the news at the time was over sick days, basically, that the railroad workers did not have sick days and basically were operating under a lot of labor standards that they did not feel were fair. So they were under negotiations with the railroad companies. One of the points of contention, I guess, had to do with safety inspections and the amount of time that they were allotted to actually inspect the cars. And so the union leaders have claimed that the railroads have been cutting costs, including these safety inspections, the amount of time that are allotted for them, which could have been addressed during negotiations. Congress interceded in those negotiations because if we had had a national railroads shutdown, the supply chain, which we already know we're all dealing with inflation, would have been just like completely just next level screwed up. And so they decided to intercede and end the strike. But that basically ends the leverage that those workers would have had to create safer conditions for themselves, but also for the community.
And that just goes to show you like the level of nuance that that we don't get in so many conversations. And really, I think we need to remember sometimes when things seem, or we feel like things are really simple or straightforward in our minds, like this is definitely the way things should be, that sometimes there's just so much more that's interconnected within how decisions are made.
Right. And that it's almost impossible to know exactly what the consequence of each thing is. And this is where it starts to become more of where they're saying it's not an accident, because there's a lot of decisions being put into it that lead up to something that over time can just become an inevitability. When you build in a certain amount of risk into how you operate your company, something is eventually going to happen. And so you might not be able to say this particular thing, but something's going to happen statistically eventually. And that's where the biggest person or entity that has been blamed, who I think rightfully deserves a decent amount of this blame here, is Norfolk Southern, the company that owns this train. So as you pointed out, Sarah, individual railroads set the heat standards for those alarms along the track. So they get to set their own heat standard. I don't know if this has caused other derailments for Norfolk Southern. That particular issue may just be like, this is something Norfolk Southern has said. We are now reevaluating whether or not that's going to be changed. And I'm sure other railroad companies are also just like thanking God that it wasn't them that this happened to, and are also changing those. Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, however, has accused the company of not participating in a lot of the initial incident command processes, providing inaccurate data and conflicting modeling. So I know this is something that people were concerned about when we were talking about like the EPA saying things are fine. It's one thing when the EPA is saying something's fine. If the data that they are using, which that's not what I'm saying exactly is happening, but they are also, Norfolk Southern is also providing a lot of this data in the process. Norfolk Southern has a stake in saying that everything's fine.
Right.
It is in their best interest to have this not be a big deal. So if you have this company providing data that's inaccurate, or modeling that's saying like, no, everything's fine, that should be something that's concerning to residents over there, and a reason that they would be a little more mistrustful of the data. And so Governor Shapiro's administration has filed a criminal complaint or recommended a criminal complaint against the company in Pennsylvania, and Ohio is doing an investigation to see if it warrants the same in their state as well. I don't know specifically if it's like an obstruction sort of deal, or if they're accusing them of hiding. They haven't said specifically what those recommended charges would be, but it is something that, so far at least, Pennsylvania is saying that Norfolk Southern hasn't been 100% forthright and the best actor in the aftermath of this disaster, not just the leading up to it part. Because I feel like negligence is sometimes harder to prove. Like we're talking about, if each individual railroads has different standards, Norfolk Southern can point to another railroad and say like, hey, they have even lower standards than ours. Yeah, this just happened to happen to us. Didn't have to do with that. So Transportation Secretary Buttigieg has pointed out that the railroad companies in general, not just Norfolk Southern, but including Norfolk Southern, have resisted many attempts by Congress and regulatory agencies to impose safety regulations in general. So some of those things are more secure cars, like stronger cars, slower speeds, different braking.
Is this just largely due to cost to the company? Do we know?
I'm sure that's what it boils down to. That is basically they are lobbying these different agencies, saying, no, this is too onerous on our company to have to pay to change these regulations over. So either they have asked that these things not happen, or tried to delay the implementation of them. So their company, I mean, like, that's what companies do, is they're trying to make money. That is their goal, is to return money to their stakeholders typically. So the idea I think that they're trying to push forward is basically that, again, it's not just Norfolk Southern was just operating, this is the best way that everyone has agreed, and it just happened to happen to us. It's that they're a part of a larger conglomeration that has been resisting changes that may have prevented this, or may prevent things like this happening in the future. So the EPA under the Superfund law, is requiring Norfolk Southern to pay for all remediation of this disaster, including all cleanup. Norfolk Southern has already repaired the rail line to resume operations, but they didn't clean up the soil under the track. And so they're going to make them undo the track and replace the soil underneath there and continue to pay for more air and water quality monitoring. I know they set up a clinic in the area as well to try and get a better idea of these long-term health impacts.
There was one CNN article that I was reading that said that Norfolk Southern is going to be required to provide a descriptive work plan on how they intend to clean up the water, soil, and debris, reimburse the EPA for providing residents a cleaning service of their homes and businesses, and show up to public meetings and explain their progress. And if they don't follow the order, the EPA will step in and do it, while fining Norfolk Southern up to $70,000 a day.
Yes.
And that came from EPA Administrator Michael Reagan during a CNN town hall.
Yeah, they're on the hook. Because earlier a town hall was happening, Norfolk Southern said that they pulled out last minute because they said they were having threats to their employees for attending this meeting. Okay, but also a lot of people are pretty upset for a good reason here. So
yeah, I don't condone threatening anybody's life either, but
certainly not. I think my bigger thing is you get to opt out of this,
right? For sure. Yeah, they need to be held accountable.
Yeah. So apparently if they drag their feet in a way, the EPA, if they start to do anything, Norfolk Southern has to reimburse them at triple the cost to the EPA. So they don't have incentive to not help out in this situation. It's hitting them monetarily, and there is some government backup on this. And that's sort of where we're at right now. Is this is still an ongoing story. And I think that we may find out in the next year, in the next 5 years, in the next 30 years, if there were long-term effects to exposure to these chemicals due to this train derailment. And I feel really bad for the residents because they should not be part of an experiment to find out if these chemicals, not that it's an incidental experiment, but it's still their lives that this is happening to. So, Sarah, do you have any thoughts about the derailment?
I feel like what you just said, I think, is the main takeaway, is that I feel for the residents. I have a lot of mixed, conflicting thoughts, I guess. And I think a lot of them I tried to bring up as we went along. But I think ultimately I feel for the residents, and I just hope that everybody is doing the best they can right now to make sure that these residents are getting taken care of as best as we can. And I think you're right. There are some things that, unfortunately, we just aren't going to know right away, and we'll have to keep learning as we go along, and that's hard and that's frustrating. And it just goes back to, there's environmental risks and consequences to everything we do, and this is just a really bad one. Again, going back to sort of the social media versus the major news outlets, there's no getting around in my mind that this isn't a big deal. This is a big deal. And that doesn't mean that it's completely disastrous. I think there were completely overblown and inaccurate pieces of information coming out of social media when this first came out. But that doesn't mean, even though not everything that was coming out initially was true, it doesn't change the fact that this is a really big deal. And I just hope that, like I said, that the cleanup folks are doing everything that they need to do, and that we see some changes to railroad safety in the future.
Yeah, I think I'm hoping that this becomes an impetus for more regulations, because these companies are profitable, but they're also doing things that, can have big consequences on residents. And I think the feelings of the people involved are just really important. And I feel initially in the reporting, there felt like a big disconnect between how the residents were responding and how the government was responding. Mm-hmm. Looking at the later articles more recently, it sounds like the EPA and the transportation boards are doing a better job of saying, no, this is serious. You are right. This is, and we're going to make sure that we're not just here for the weekend. We're here for the long haul. And we're going to make sure we keep doing testing. So I think that's good. And I'm hoping that the residents feel heard and that they, whatever their concerns are getting addressed.
Yes.
And we didn't cover, because this is too small an episode for this, but like what materials should be on trains.
Right. Yeah. Oh, there's so much more that we could go into this. And it's just so hard. I mean, I was thinking about what we've talked about with nuclear power plants when we were talking about this and sort of the risks that are associated with that. And I just feel like there are a lot of different facets and ways to look at this. And yeah, I do hope that this can be a source for people to become more aware and for some changes to get made.
Well, thanks for talking to me, Sara. Thanks for listening, everybody. Stick around. We'll give you our challenge for the week in a moment. All right, guys, we're back with our challenge of the week. This one's pretty straightforward. Keep looking at the news for updates on this particular disaster that happened, whether that means that you're following certain social media or you're looking at different news sites about what the updates are. I definitely recommend going straight to the source on some of these. Like the EPA and the Transportation Department have both put out initial reports on their findings here, but they have not put out their like final investigations or anything. So there's still lots of updates that we'll probably get here. And I think it is important to get both the vibe check of how the residents are feeling as well as the structural things. And I also think, if you're spending any time contemplating this week, maybe start thinking about those questions that I hadn't thought about before, which is things like what should be on trains and what comfortability do we have around risk and things like that that you won't necessarily have answers to, but that we can start thinking about as facets of our lives that are sort of in the background. I hear the train occasionally coming by, and I don't always think about what's on it. And now it's a little bit more forward in my mind, and it's interesting to know there's so many parts of our world that are happening that we take for granted, and maybe there's things that we should just be thinking a little bit more about.
Right. And because I'm already just thinking about that question. I'm like, okay, but if we don't transport them by train, like what's the safer, trucks crash.
Right.
Plane. Well, I don't think I want my chemicals on planes.
This one I don't have a good answer to. It does prompt something, though, that I have heard there's safety issues on trains that are not existent, for example, in pipelines, which I have not investigated. And that might be a future episode of what do we need to look at about the pros and cons of these different areas.
But that's what I like about the question is the answer's not necessarily no, we shouldn't carry these things on trains anymore, but it just gets you thinking about, hey, what are the safest ways that we can do this? What are the other options? These are just things that I don't think about very often.
What are the responsibilities of these railroads and the workers, and what are the implications of these broader things? So yeah, they're out there. Hopefully I learned things during this process. I did not feel like I necessarily, I came across a lot of good articles that I have linked in the show notes here, but I didn't always feel like all of them had every piece I was looking for. And I don't think that they will because of just the evolving nature of this timeline. But yeah, take a look. If you want more details, there are more details out there. And I appreciate you guys listening. If you guys have any questions about this or comments or thoughts or personal experiences, maybe you live in the area, Sara, where can they reach us?
We are on Facebook. You can find us at A Little Greener Podcast. We're on Instagram at A Little Greener Pod. We're on Twitter at A Greener Podcast. And you can email us at A Little Greener Podcast at gmail.com.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for hanging out with me, Sara.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Yeah, we'll talk to you guys next week.
Bye.